Back in 2015, I bought this Chevy S10 for about $500. At the time, I was looking for something to hot rod, but wanted to focus on the outer appearance first and see where I ended up before spending time and money on a drivetrain swap. Originally, I planned on adding a turbo to the oil crisis era 2.5-liter engine these trucks came with, but due to lack of community support for such modifications to the Iron Duke engine, as it's called, I started to collect V8 swap parts. Around the same time, I was pretty satisfied with how the exterior of the truck came together, so I was ready to focus more on the performance aspect. However, I still needed an engine and transmission to get started. In mid-2018, I met one of my Instagram friends in person when we realized that we were only living about 10 miles apart at the time. And while helping her fix the sway bar on her 1999 Suburban, it came up in conversation that she also had a part Suburban that was in a fatal wreck with the engine still in it. She also mentioned that they planned on recycling it soon, so I jokingly mentioned that it would be a perfect engine for my V8 Swap S10. Later that same summer, she told me I could come pull the engine, and that's where this video starts. There's not many ways to kill a Suburban or its occupants, but unfortunately, a partial overlap collision with a snowplow is one of those things. And I'm not trying to be morbid here, but I just want to raise awareness that even in the strongest and biggest of vehicles, we still are not invincible. And while this particular instance was inclement weather related, I ask all of you to drive safely, drive sober, and don't drive distracted. Now, because this is a parts car that is beyond repair, removal of the engine itself actually turned out to be a pretty simple task, especially since we could use tools like oxyacetylene torches and sawzalls to cut stuff where possible in order to save time. In addition to the engine, I wanted to pull as much of the drivetrain related stuff as I could, including electronics, since I could always get rid of unused parts later, after I figured out what I actually can use for the swap. And since I've actually always wanted a GMT 400 based SUV like this one, what I don't use for the swap I can shelf as spare parts for a future Tahoe or Suburban. With the engine, transmission, and transfer case pulled, since this is a four-wheel drive truck, we worked on pulling the front axle and the rear axle. And to pull the front axle, we actually cut the front half of the frame off so that we could work on that later on in the garage after it got dark, and focused on the rest of the truck, including the removal of the fuel tank, the rear axle, and some of the other cosmetic bits that I wanted to shelf as spare parts. To remove the rear axle, we ended up turning the truck on its side, and we placed a tarp down expecting that the rear glass would break. But lucky for us, that was not the case. Removal of the rear axle actually proved to be somewhat difficult, as all of the U-bolts holding the axle in were rusted, but those U-bolts were no match for a little bit of flammable wrench. So you remember how we put that tarp on the passenger side?
Oh, there it goes.
The other window shattered instead. After transporting the drivetrain to La Plata, Maryland, it was time to separate the engine from the transmission, where I learned that torque converters, aka disappointment donuts, are deceivingly heavy. Once the engine was on the engine stand, I wanted to check the cylinders themselves for any moisture or water that may have entered, as the Suburban had been sitting outside in a wrecked state for over 2 years. With the intake manifold removed and the valley exposed, things were looking pretty good so far. Dirty and grimy, yes, but no signs of serious rust or sludge. With the cylinder heads removed, I actually found some standing water in 2 of the cylinders, but it appeared as though the cylinder walls were not rusted enough to halt the rebuild process. Also, with the accessories and the heads removed, it was possible to easily turn the lower end of the engine, which is also a great sign when dealing with an engine rebuild of any kind. Due to the severity of the wreck, most of the computer-related electronics were either damaged or destroyed. However, the intake manifold itself remained intact, so I decided to clean it when I cleaned the rest of the engine parts. Since the computer itself was destroyed in the accident, and buying a replacement with a complete harness was going to be cost prohibitive, especially when you begin to factor in tuning costs to program out all the stuff that won't be connected to the harness, I started looking at other fuel delivery options and ultimately decided that I would probably be going with Vortec for its out-of-the-box simplicity. This would also mean that I would need a completely different intake to bolt the Vortec to the vehicle, so after cleaning this intake, I shelved it as spare parts and bought a Summit Racing intake manifold that was compatible with the Vortec heads. With the block clean and free of any loose rust particles, I decided it was time to paint the engine so that it had time to dry before reassembly. I started with a few coats of gray engine paint primer, which will hold up to the high temperatures that engines produce. After priming, I painted it this gold color, and I really didn't like how the color came out. It just looked too orangey, so off it came. The advantage to painting the engine twice was I was able to see where paint was not adhering and pay special attention to those areas to make sure they were extra clean. This will ensure proper adhesion with the second color I choose, and it should help increase the resistance to fluids like oil, which would seep under any loose paint. After priming all of the engine parts, including the heads and valve covers, I decided to paint the heads black and paint the valve covers and block a nice gunmetal silver color. I figure if I paint the truck from its current black color to a different color, the more neutral silver and black colors will complement almost any color that I choose. But that's a decision for another day. Tune in next time on Trip the Road for when we reassemble the engine and prepare the S10 for the swap. If you haven't already, be sure to like and subscribe so that you get the latest updates on this project. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.